My name is Claire Holloway. I'm 37 years old, and for most of my adult life, people have described me with words that sound harmless. Easygoing, low maintenance, not demanding. I work full-time, I keep my life organized, and I don't ask for much. I don't raise my voice. I don't dramatize my feelings. I've always believed that calm was a strength, and that love didn't need constant negotiation to survive. From the outside, I'm the kind of partner people admire quietly but rarely examine. I remember birthdays. I notice when groceries run low. I smooth over awkward moments before they harden into conflict. I make things easier for everyone. And because of that, I've often been underestimated. Not in an obvious way. No one ever called me weak. They just assumed I would handle it, whatever it was. This story isn't about betrayal in the traditional sense. There's no shocking affair, no screaming matches, no dramatic exits. It's about something quieter, and in many ways more common. It's about what happens when being low maintenance stops being a compliment and starts becoming a justification. A reason someone feels entitled to your effort, your flexibility, your silence. When my partner first called me low maintenance, he smiled when he said it. He meant it as praise, and I accepted it that way. For a long time, I wore that label with pride. I told myself it meant I was mature, independent, secure. I told myself that relationships didn't need constant upkeep if they were built on trust. But slowly, so slowly, I didn't recognize it at first. That word began to reshape the balance between us. Expectations shifted. Effort became one-sided. What I gave was no longer noticed because it had become normal. What I needed became invisible because I didn't ask loudly enough. This story is about the moment I realized that maintaining everything, emotionally, practically, invisibly, wasn't neutral. It was sustaining a system that depended on my silence. And when I finally stopped maintaining everything, not out of anger but out of clarity, something unexpected happened. Indifference didn't punish him, it exposed his dependence. What you'll hear in this story is not revenge, and it's not a victory lap. There's no humiliation, no grand speech, no dramatic showdown. What unfolds is a quiet shift, a withdrawal of labor that had always been assumed, never acknowledged. And in that absence, the truth became impossible to ignore. I'm telling this honestly, without exaggeration, because I think many people, especially women, are taught that being easy to be with is the same as being valued. This is a story about unlearning that belief, about choosing self-respect without cruelty, about discovering that sometimes the most powerful change happens when you stop explaining and simply stop providing. Have you ever wondered whether the peace you were preserving was actually costing you more than it was worth? To understand what happened later, you need to understand who I was before anything went wrong. I was the steady one, the adaptable one, the person who made life feel smoother just by being present. In our relationship, I became known as the one who didn't need much. I didn't need constant reassurance. I didn't need elaborate plans. I didn't need my feelings checked in on regularly. At least, that's how it looked. And because it looked that way, it was accepted as truth. When friends described us, they'd say things like, "You're so lucky, Claire is so chill," or "You've got it easy, she's not high maintenance at all." He would laugh and agree. Sometimes he'd add, "Yeah, she's just easy." Easy. As if I were a system that ran itself. What they didn't see was the quiet labor behind that ease. The mental notes, the emotional calibration, the constant adjustments I made so nothing felt heavy. If he had a bad day, I gave him space before he even asked. If plans changed last minute, I absorbed the inconvenience without comment. If something bothered me, I waited until it felt small enough to swallow. I told myself this was maturity. Those relationships weren't about tallying effort. That love meant flexibility. And because I never announced what I was doing, it slowly disappeared from view, even to him. Over time, my role solidified. I was the background constant, the one who remembered, the one who accommodated, the one who would be fine if something slipped through the cracks. And because I was fine, at least outwardly, there was no reason for anyone to question the balance. If I didn't express disappointment, there was none. If I didn't ask for more, there was no lack. That's how invisibility works. It doesn't arrive as rejection, it arrives as assumption. I noticed it in small moments. He'd forget something important to me and say, "You're not really the kind of person who cares about that stuff, right?" Not unkindly, just confidently, as if he knew me better than I knew myself. When decisions were made, I was informed rather than consulted, not because he was controlling, but because he assumed I'd adapt. And I usually did. Friends came to me for advice, not concern. They saw me as grounded, unshakable, someone who didn't need much support. Even my own needs began to feel hypothetical, like optional extras rather than real requirements. And the strange thing was, I helped build that image. Every time I chose calm over clarity, every time I minimized my own reaction, every time I said, "It's fine," when it wasn't. I didn't do it to be liked. I did it because I believed that love thrived best without friction. I believed that asking for less made me easier for me to stay with. I believed that if I didn't complicate things, I would be appreciated, seen for my stability. But appreciation and dependence aren't the same thing. I was dependent on, deeply. For emotional regulation, for consistency, for keeping things from falling apart in ways no one ever named. But dependence doesn't always look like gratitude. Sometimes it looks like entitlement wearing comfort. And so I became a fixture rather than a presence. Something reliable enough to fade into the background. I don't blame anyone for this, not even him. Roles like this are rarely assigned out loud. They form slowly, through patterns that go unquestioned because nothing appears broken. From the outside, we looked balanced, calm, functional. But inside that calm, something was quietly being trained into me. Don't ask, don't disrupt, don't need. And the more I succeeded at that, the more invisible I became. I didn't know yet that this invisibility would one day give me clarity. At the time, it just felt like being trusted, like being chosen because I was low maintenance. I didn't realize that what they saw as strength had become a convenience. The first moment didn't feel important at the time. That's why it stayed with me. It happened on an ordinary evening. No raised voices, no argument, nothing that would stand out if you retold it later. We were sitting at the kitchen counter, half distracted, talking about weekend plans. I mentioned something I'd been looking forward to. A small thing, a quiet thing, time set aside just for us. He barely looked up from his phone. "Oh," he said after a pause, "I didn't think that really mattered to you." There was no edge in his voice. No cruelty, just certainty. I remember smiling automatically, the way you do when you're not sure yet whether something is a joke or a misunderstanding. I said something like, "It does, actually." Light, casual, easy to dismiss if he wanted to. He nodded, still scrolling. "Right. I just figured you were low maintenance about that stuff." That was it. The moment passed. The conversation moved on. If anyone else had been there, they wouldn't have noticed a thing, but something in me went still. Not hurt, not angry, just alert. Because what he'd said wasn't just about plans, it was about permission. He had already decided, without checking, what I was allowed to want. And he'd done it based on a version of me I had helped create. I didn't correct him. Not fully. I didn't insist. I let the plan change. And on the surface, nothing happened. But internally, I replayed the moment again and again, not because it was dramatic, but because it was clean, precise. A single assumption, stated out loud. You don't care about this. You don't need this. You're fine without it. That night, I lay awake longer than usual. Not upset, just thinking. I told myself I was being sensitive, that this was what healthy relationships looked like: flexibility, compromise, understanding. Still, my body had registered something my mind was trying to dismiss. In the weeks that followed, similar moments appeared, small enough to ignore individually. A comment here, a decision was made there, always wrapped in logic, always justified by my reputation for being easy. You won't mind. You're not really into that. You're fine either way. No one else reacted. Friends didn't notice. If I mentioned it gently, it was brushed aside with, "He didn't mean anything by it." And they were right. He didn't. That was the problem. Disrespect doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives as efficiency, as assumptions that save time, as skipping the step where you ask. And because I wasn't visibly harmed by it, there was no reason for anyone else to take it seriously. Even I didn't at first, but I began to notice a pattern. My preferences were being edited out of our shared reality, not argued against, just quietly bypassed. I still had opinions, I just wasn't being consulted, and the more I adapted, the more normal it became. The first small cut isn't painful. It's educational. It teaches others what they can do without consequence, and it teaches you what you're expected to tolerate. I didn't confront him. I didn't make a point. I simply absorbed it, like I always had. But something subtle shifted inside me, not emotionally, but observationally. I started watching instead of sleeping, listening instead of explaining, not to catch him doing something wrong, but to understand the structure I was part of. That was the beginning, not of conflict, but of awareness. I didn't know yet what I would do with that awareness. I only knew I wouldn't forget it. Once something happens twice, it starts to feel like a coincidence. Once it happens 3 times, it starts to feel like a pattern. And once it becomes routine, it stops feeling like anything at all. That's how normalization works. After that first small cut, nothing in our relationship visibly changed. We still laughed. We still functioned well together. There were no arguments, no cold silences, no dramatic shifts in tone. If anything, things felt smoother because I adjusted faster. When my preferences weren't considered, I told myself it was efficiency. When decisions were made without me, I called it trust. When effort became uneven, I framed it as independence. I was very good at reframing. Each time I noticed a moment of dismissal, I found a way to soften it. He's tired. He's stressed. It's not intentional. And above all, this isn't worth making a thing out of. That last thought became my default, because making a thing out of it would mean admitting something uncomfortable, that being low maintenance had turned into being low priority. So instead, I normalized it. If he forgot something that mattered to me, I reminded myself that I rarely asked for anything. If plans shifted around his schedule, I told myself I was flexible. If my emotional check-ins became shorter while his remained extensive, I said it was because I was stable. Stability can become a trap when it's mistaken for self-erasure. What made it harder to see was how reasonable everything looked from the outside. There was no villain, no explosive behavior, just a gradual redistribution of care that happened so quietly it felt mutual, even when it wasn't. He began to rely on my silence. Not consciously, not maliciously, but functionally. If I didn't raise an issue, it didn't exist. If I adapted, the adaptation became the new baseline. If I didn't protest, it was assumed I agreed. And because I had trained everyone, including him, to see me as someone who didn't need much, the idea that something might be wrong felt almost illogical. "You're the most understanding person I know," he told me once, with genuine affection. "That's why this works." At the time, I took it as a compliment. Now I hear the subtext: "You don't challenge me." I noticed that when I did speak up, softly, carefully, there was confusion rather than defensiveness, as if my needs had appeared out of nowhere. "I didn't know you cared about that," he'd say, surprised. "You never mentioned it before." And he was right. I hadn't. Not because it didn't matter, but because I'd learned that mentioning it changed very little. So I stopped trying. That's how respect erodes, not through conflict, but through absence. The absence of friction, the absence of consequence, the absence of acknowledgement. And still, I stayed calm, kind, present. I was proud of how mature I was being, but beneath that pride was something else growing, quiet, unexpressed, but steady. A sense that my role was no longer being negotiated. It had been assigned, and the assignment came with expectations I hadn't agreed to, but was fulfilling anyway. I began to see myself from the outside. How convenient I was, how rarely I disrupted the flow, how easy it was to build a life around someone like me without ever checking if I was still comfortable inside it. And the strangest part was this: the more I disappeared, the more stable everything looked. That's when I understood something important. Stability doesn't always mean balance. Sometimes it just means one person is absorbing the weight quietly. I didn't confront him. I didn't announce a problem. I didn't even change my behavior yet. But internally, I stopped defending the situation. I stopped telling myself it was nothing. Because once you stop rationalizing, you start seeing clearly. And clarity is dangerous to systems built on assumptions. Once I stopped explaining things away, the shape of my role became impossible to ignore. It wasn't written down anywhere. No one ever said it out loud. But it was understood. By him, by our friends, by the rhythm of our life together. I was the reliable one. The one who would remember. The one who would adjust. The one who would not make things difficult. My value wasn't questioned, but it was specific. I was useful in a way that didn't require tending, like good infrastructure. You don't praise it daily, you only notice it when it fails. And I rarely failed. When something needed to be handled, it was assumed I'd handle it. When something went wrong, I smoothed it out before it became visible. When tension appeared, I absorbed it internally so the surface stayed calm. This wasn't something he demanded, it was something the system rewarded. The more dependable I was, the less I was checked in with. The less I was checked in with, the easier it became to assume I was fine. And the easier it was to assume I was fine, the more responsibility quietly shifted onto me. I saw it clearly when I imagined what would happen if I stopped. If I forgot something important. If I said no without explanation. If I didn't anticipate needs in advance. The image felt almost absurd, not because it would cause chaos, but because it would violate expectation. And expectation, I realized, was the real structure holding everything together. I wasn't just a partner. I was the emotional buffer, the one who made life feel manageable, the one who absorbed the inconvenience so others didn't have to, the one whose inner life was considered stable enough not require maintenance. Ironically, my emotional strength had made me emotionally unattended. And because I didn't complain, there was no incentive for change. That's when it hit me. This role only worked because I kept performing it. It required my constant participation. I remembered a moment at a gathering where someone joked, if Claire ran the world, everything would just work. Everyone laughed, including me. But later that night, I thought about it differently. If everything just worked, it was because someone was doing the work, and that someone was invisible by design. I wasn't angry. I wasn't resentful. I was precise. I could see the boundaries of my role now, what I was expected to give, what I was not expected to ask for, where my presence was appreciated, and where my absence would only be noticed if something stopped functioning. I understood then why my needs had felt so negotiable. They didn't fit the role. And I also understood something else, something quietly liberating. If this role had been assigned without my consent, it could also be declined without confrontation. Not dramatically, not punitively, simply by no longer maintaining it. But I wasn't ready yet. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to be intentional. I didn't want to act out of emotion. I wanted to act out of alignment. So I stayed. I observed. I learned the system thoroughly, where it relied on me, where it assumed me, where my effort was quietly essential. And I kept playing my role a little longer, not to preserve the relationship, but to understand exactly what would happen when I stepped out of it. Because sometimes the most honest thing you can do is stop fulfilling a role that was never meant to be permanent. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no breaking point, no final straw, no moment where I felt overwhelmed or emotional. In fact, the day it happened was almost disappointingly ordinary. It was a weekday morning. The light was flat and gray. We were both moving through our routines on parallel tracks, close, but not really intersecting. He was talking about his schedule, his deadlines, and his stress. I was listening, like I always did, nodding, offering small, practical reassurances. At one point, he paused and said, almost absent-mindedly, "Can you handle that thing later?" He didn't specify. He didn't need to. I knew what he meant. Normally, I would have said yes without thinking, not because I wanted to, but because it was expected. Because I was good at handling things, because my ability to absorb tasks was part of the unspoken agreement. But something in me didn't move. I wasn't tired. I wasn't irritated. I just didn't automatically agree. There was a silence, barely a second long. But in that second, I felt a shift inside myself, a clear, almost clinical realization. I don't actually have to do this. The thought wasn't rebellious. It wasn't emotional. It was factual. And that frightened me. Not because it felt wrong, but because it felt true. I said calmly, "I'm not sure. I'll see." He nodded and moved on. No reaction, no tension. And yet, everything had changed. Because for the first time, I had interrupted the pattern internally, even though nothing external had shifted yet. I had noticed the moment where my automatic compliance usually lived, and I had stepped around it. That was the day I stopped responding on reflex. Not outwardly. Outwardly, I was the same. Calm, attentive, functional. But inside, I began pausing. When he assumed I'd managed something, I noticed the assumption. When plans were formed without me, I registered the omission. When my emotional labor filled in gaps, I saw the gap instead of the filling. This wasn't withdrawal, it was awareness. And awareness is destabilizing, not to the relationship immediately, but to the role you've been playing within it. I realized then that I had been maintaining more than logistics or harmony. I had been maintaining an identity, one that required me to be endlessly accommodating in order to feel secure. That morning, I understood something quietly radical. Being low maintenance had become a performance. Not a lie, but a role I had outgrown. I didn't feel the urge to confront him. That would have been premature. The shift wasn't about him yet. It was about me reclaiming my internal consent. So I did something far more subtle. I stopped preempting. I didn't remind him of things unless he asked. I didn't smooth over awkwardness before it surfaced. I didn't fill silences with reassurance. I wasn't cold. I wasn't distant. I was simply present without compensating. And in that presence, I felt lighter. Not empowered, not vindicated, just lighter. I began to understand how much energy had gone into being predictable. How much attention did it take to be consistently easy? Letting go of that didn't feel like a loss, it felt like accuracy. I didn't know yet where this would lead. I hadn't decided anything, I was still in the relationship, still participating, still caring, but the axis had shifted. I was no longer maintaining everything by default, and once a default is broken, it can never fully be restored. At first, no one noticed. That was the most revealing part. When I stopped anticipating, stopped cushioning, stopped filling in the emotional gaps before they became visible, nothing immediately collapsed. The days still moved forward, conversations still happened, life still functioned. Which meant two things were true at once. One, I had been doing more than anyone realized. Two, I had been doing it so seamlessly that its absence took time to register. My silence changed texture. It wasn't the silence of avoidance or resentment. It was deliberate, observant, calm. When something bothered me, I didn't rush to soften it. I let the discomfort exist. When something was unclear, I didn't clarify it preemptively. I waited to be asked. This wasn't punishment. It was consent. I was no longer volunteering simply because it was expected. And because I didn't announce this change, it was misread. He thought I was tired, then distracted, then eventually he thought of nothing at all. Because silence, when you're used to it, doesn't immediately raise alarms. What changed first wasn't his behavior. It was the atmosphere. Tiny inefficiencies appeared, minor misunderstandings, small moments where things didn't flow quite as smoothly as before. He'd pause mid-sentence, waiting for reassurance that didn't come. He'd look at me expectantly when something went unresolved, and I'd meet his gaze calmly, without rushing to fix it. At first, he filled the space himself. Then he began to notice the space. "You're quiet lately," he said one evening. Not accusing, curious. "I'm listening," I replied. And I was. That was the truth. Listening without managing, listening without adjusting myself to absorb the impact. Silence became a mirror instead of a cushion, and mirrors make people aware of their own movements. What surprised me was how quickly silence revealed dependency. Not dramatic dependency, not emotional collapse, but reliance on a certain kind of emotional infrastructure, the kind that anticipates needs before they're voiced, smooths over friction before it's acknowledged, and reassures without being asked. When that infrastructure paused, even slightly, the system faltered. Not enough to panic, just enough to be noticed. He started double-checking things he'd never had to before, asking questions he used to assume answers to, hesitating, and still, he didn't connect it to me. Because the idea that I had been actively maintaining that sense of ease had never occurred to him. Why would it? Maintenance is invisible by design. What he mistook for weakness, my quietness, was actually restraint. I could have spoken. I could have explained. I could have said, "This is what I've been doing all along." But the explanation would have returned me to the role of emotional translator. So I stayed quiet, not withdrawn, not resentful, just present without overfunctioning. And in that presence, I learned something important. Silence doesn't create distance when it's honest. It creates clarity. The relationship began to feel different. Not worse, but less padded, more exposed, less buffered by my constant effort. I didn't feel guilty. Because I wasn't withholding love. I was withholding compensation. There's a difference. I was still kind, still responsive, still engaged. I just wasn't carrying more than my share anymore. And when silence becomes a choice instead of a default, it stops being weakness. It becomes leverage. Not the kind you wield, but the kind that reveals truth. While the surface of our life continued as usual, something else was happening underneath, something no one noticed, because it didn't announce itself. Preparation, not the dramatic kind. No secret plans, no revenge fantasies. Just quiet alignment. Once I stopped overfunctioning, I had time, mental space, emotional clarity. And with that clarity came a different way of seeing my own position. I began documenting, not in a literal sense, but in awareness. I noticed patterns instead of reacting to them. I paid attention to where my effort had been essential and where it had been taken for granted. I realized how often I had acted as the emotional regulator. How many decisions had flowed smoothly because I was there to absorb uncertainty. How many small crises never escalated because I stepped in before they became visible. None of that had been assigned. None of it had been recognized. And now, none of it was automatic. What surprised me was how quickly I began to feel stable. Not relieved, not triumphant, stable. Because when you stop compensating for imbalance, your nervous system recalibrates. You stop bracing, you stop anticipating impact. You stop performing calmness as a service. I also began to learn about myself. I noticed how much of my identity had been built around being useful. How much validation I derived from being needed but undemanding. How deeply I had internalized the belief that asking for less made me safer. Letting that go felt like stepping out of a narrow room into a wider one. I didn't announce any of this. I didn't signal a change. On the outside, I was still the same person. Measured, composed, attentive. But internally, I was repositioning. I started doing something very simple and very radical. I let consequences exist. If something was forgotten, I didn't rescue it. If something was unclear, I didn't clarify it preemptively. If something felt off, I didn't neutralize it with reassurance, not to teach a lesson, but to see what would happen. And what happened was information. Information about where the relationship actually stood without my constant reinforcement. He began to feel the weight of decisions he hadn't realized I'd been sharing. He encountered emotional gaps I'd been quietly filling. He noticed friction where there used to be flow. Still, he didn't blame me. Because nothing I was doing looked like a refusal. It looked like neutrality. And neutrality, when you're used to accommodation, feels strangely unsettling. What they never noticed was how much strength it took for me not to step in. Restraint is not passive, it's disciplined. I was choosing myself, not loudly, not dramatically, but consistently. And in doing so, I began to recognize my leverage. Not power over him, power over my participation. I could see how much of the relationship's ease depended on my invisible labor. How much emotional continuity I had been providing, how much of the us was actually being held together by my effort to keep things light. That knowledge didn't make me angry. It made me precise. I began quietly organizing my life in ways that didn't center him. Not as a threat, but as a reality check. I strengthened routines that didn't rely on shared momentum. I invested in my own steadiness rather than relational harmony. Emotionally, practically, internally, I wasn't pulling away. I was standing on my own feet. And when you do that, the ground shifts. Not because you've moved, but because the system around you was leaning. He sensed something, not enough to name it, but enough to feel less secure in his assumptions. "You seem different," he said once. Not upset, just uncertain. I smiled. "I am." That was all, because by then I understood something crucial. The quietest preparation isn't about planning an exit or executing a strategy. It's about making yourself whole enough that you no longer need to maintain an imbalance to feel safe. And once you reach that point, every option becomes clearer. The reveal didn't come with a surge of emotion. There was no rush of adrenaline, no sense of victory, no moment where everything suddenly made sense. It arrived quietly, almost clinically, in the form of a realization that settled rather than exploded. I wasn't trapped, not emotionally, not practically, not even relationally. I had believed, without ever stating it outright, that my calm was holding everything together. That if I stopped maintaining the balance, something important would break. That the cost of asserting myself would be instability, conflict, loss, disruption. And in that presence, I learned something important. Silence doesn't create distance when it's honest. It creates clarity. The relationship began to feel different, not worse, but less padded, more exposed, less buffered by my constant effort. I didn't feel guilty because I wasn't withholding love. I was withholding compensation. There's a difference. I was still kind, still responsive, still engaged. I just wasn't carrying more than my share anymore. And when silence becomes a choice instead of a default, it stops being weakness. It becomes leverage, not the kind you wield, but the kind that reveals truth. While the surface of our life continued as usual, something else was happening underneath, something no one noticed, because it didn't announce itself. Preparation, not the dramatic kind, no secret plans, no revenge fantasies, just quiet alignment. Once I stopped overfunctioning, I had time, mental space, emotional clarity. And with that clarity came a different way of seeing my own position. I began documenting, not in a literal sense, but in awareness. I noticed patterns instead of reacting to them. I paid attention to where my effort had been essential and where it had been taken for granted. I realized how often I had acted as the emotional regulator, how many decisions had flowed smoothly because I was there to absorb uncertainty, how many small crises never escalated because I stepped in before they became visible. None of that had been assigned. None of it had been recognized. And now, none of it was automatic. What surprised me was how quickly I began to feel stable, not relieved, not triumphant, stable. Because when you stop compensating for imbalance, your nervous system recalibrates. You stop bracing. You stop anticipating impact. You stop performing calmness as a service. I also began to learn about myself. I noticed how much of my identity had been built around being useful, how much validation I derived from being needed but undemanding, how deeply I had internalized the belief that asking for less made me safer. Letting that go felt like stepping out of a narrow room into a wider one. I didn't announce any of this. I didn't signal a change. On the outside, I was still the same person, measured, composed, attentive. But internally, I was repositioning. I started doing something very simple and very radical. I let consequences exist. If something was forgotten, I didn't rescue it. If something was unclear, I didn't clarify it preemptively. If something felt off, I didn't neutralize it with reassurance. Not to teach a lesson, but to see what would happen. And what happened was information. Information about where the relationship actually stood without my constant reinforcement. He began to feel the weight of decisions he hadn't realized I'd been sharing. He encountered emotional gaps I'd been quietly filling. He noticed friction where there used to be flow. Still, he didn't blame me. Because nothing I was doing looked like a refusal. It looked like neutrality. And neutrality, when you're used to accommodation, feels strangely unsettling. What they never noticed was how much strength it took for me not step in. Restraint is not passive. It's disciplined. I was choosing myself, not loudly, not dramatically, but consistently. And in doing so, I began to recognize my leverage. Not power over him, power over my participation. I could see how much of the relationship's ease depended on my invisible labor. How much emotional continuity had been provided. How much of the us was actually being held together by my effort to keep things light. That knowledge didn't make me angry, it made me precise. I began quietly organizing my life in ways that didn't center him, not as a threat, but as a reality check. I strengthened routines that didn't rely on shared momentum. I invested in my own steadiness rather than relational harmony. Emotionally, practically, internally. I wasn't pulling away. I was standing on my own feet. And when you do that, the ground shifts. Not because you've moved, but because the system around you was leaning. He sensed something, not enough to name it, but enough to feel less secure in his assumptions. "You seem different," he said once. Not upset, just uncertain. I smiled. "I am." That was all, because by then I understood something crucial. The quietest preparation isn't about planning an exit or executing a strategy. It's about making yourself whole enough that you no longer need to maintain an imbalance to feel safe. And once you reach that point, every option becomes clearer. The reveal didn't come with a surge of emotion. There was no rush of adrenaline, no sense of victory, no moment where everything suddenly made sense. It arrived quietly, almost clinically, in the form of a realization that settled rather than exploded. I wasn't trapped, not emotionally, not practically, not even relationally. I had believed, without ever stating it outright, that my calm was holding everything together, that if I stopped maintaining the balance, something important would break, that the cost of asserting myself would be instability, conflict, loss, disruption. But as I stepped back, I saw something different. The structure didn't collapse. It leaned. And in that lean, the truth was exposed. He needed my steadiness more than I needed his presence, not in a dramatic, dependent way, but in a functional one. The relationship worked as smoothly as it did because I absorbed complexity. I translated emotions, I regulated my pace, I carried the weight of continuity. When I stopped doing that, the relationship didn't end, but it became heavier for him. And that heaviness was information. The private reveal was this: I had leverage without ever intending to create it. Not because I was withholding something unique or irreplaceable, but because I had been providing something foundational without recognition. Ease. Stability. I wanted to know what I could sustain without emotional or practical entanglement. Knowing your position is different from preparing an exit, but it gives you steadiness. I clarified my own boundaries internally before expressing any externally. That way, when I said no, it wasn't reactive. It was final. I reduced overlap where it wasn't necessary. I kept my routines intact, my responsibilities cleanly separated, not to create distance, but to remove dependence. And still, nothing looked wrong. We still shared space, still spoke kindly, still functioned as a couple on the surface. But beneath that surface, the relationship was no longer being stabilized by me. That's the thing about invisible labor. Once you stop providing it, you don't have to do anything else. The absence does the work for you. He began to feel it more clearly now, not in crisis, but in confusion. Things that used to resolve themselves didn't. Conversations ended without the usual reassurance. Plans required more effort. Emotional moments felt less padded. He would pause sometimes, as if waiting for me to smooth something over. And I wouldn't. I didn't ignore him. I didn't withdraw. I simply responded at face value without enhancement. If he was unsure, I didn't reassure automatically. If he was frustrated, I didn't absorb it. If he was quiet, I didn't fill the silence. I let things land where they landed. This was the most disciplined thing I had ever done, because it would have been easy to step back into the role, to rescue the ease, to restore the familiar rhythm. That reflex still existed, but I didn't act on it. Instead, I observed. And what I observed was telling. He started asking questions, not about me, but about us. About what had changed, about why things felt different. I answered honestly, but briefly. I'm just doing what I can do. I'm being more direct. I'm not assuming anymore. These weren't accusations, they were facts. He tried to compensate at first, offering small gestures, checking in more often, reintroducing attentiveness in ways that felt new. But attentiveness without structural change doesn't restore balance, and I could feel it. The relationship was trying to self-correct without addressing the core issue, that it had relied on my silence as stability. Moving in silence meant not interrupting that process. I didn't explain what I was doing. I didn't narrate my internal shift. I didn't demand recognition, because recognition was no longer the goal. Clarity was. I wanted to see what would happen if I stayed consistent, if I continued to show up as myself without cushioning the dynamic. And what happened was subtle but decisive. The imbalance could no longer be hidden. And once something is visible, it cannot return to being invisible. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They arrived the way water finds cracks, slowly, persistently, without announcement. At first, he couldn't name what felt wrong. He just knew that something no longer worked the way it used to. The ease was gone, not replaced by conflict, but by effort. Things required attention now. Decisions took longer. Emotional moments lingered instead of dissolving. Silence stretched instead of being smoothed over. And because I wasn't stepping in to manage those moments, they stayed where they landed. He began to feel it in small, practical ways. Plans that used to come together seamlessly now require coordination. Conversations that once ended with reassurance now ended with uncertainty. He had to ask questions he'd never needed to ask before. Are you okay? Did I do something wrong? Is everything fine? I answered honestly. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, sometimes I don't know. I didn't rush to make things comfortable. That was new. What unsettled him wasn't my answers. It was the lack of buffering around them. I wasn't distressed. I wasn't cold. I was neutral. And neutrality can feel like a loss when you're used to emotional cushioning. He started compensating in familiar ways, being more attentive, more present, more careful with his words. But the effort felt reactive rather than grounded, like someone adjusting to a system change without understanding the system. I could see his discomfort growing, not as anger, but as uncertainty, because for the first time he was carrying his own emotional weight. The relationship no longer moved on autopilot, and that effort revealed something important: how much he had relied on me to keep things smooth without ever realizing it. He began to reminisce out loud about how easy things used to be, how relaxed we were, how little tension there was. I listened, and I understood what he meant, but I also understood what he didn't. That ease had been maintained. It hadn't been mutual. The consequences weren't punitive. They were structural. When one person stops overfunctioning, the imbalance becomes shared, or the system strains. I could feel the strain now, not enough to break, but enough to demand attention. He started checking his phone more when we were apart, initiating contact more often, seeking reassurance that I used to give freely. And each time I responded honestly, but without excess. I didn't escalate. I didn't soothe beyond what was true. That was the hardest part, because it meant allowing discomfort to exist without rushing to fix it. And discomfort, once allowed, teaches people things they can't unlearn. He began to realize slowly that something had been removed. Not affection, not love, support. The kind that doesn't announce itself until it's gone. And still, I didn't explain, because an explanation would have softened the impact. And this wasn't about making a point. It was about letting reality do what it does best. The consequences had begun, not as punishment, but as exposure. By the time he realized something was truly wrong, the window for fixing it had already closed. Not because I was unforgiving, not because I had hardened, but because I had already crossed an internal line. He became more explicit then, less tentative. He started naming what he felt instead of circling it. I feel like I'm losing you, he said one evening, sitting across from me with a seriousness I hadn't seen before. I didn't rush to reassure him. I asked, "What does that feel like?" He struggled to answer. That hesitation told me everything. He wasn't losing me. He was losing the version of me that made things effortless. He tried to course correct. He apologized, not for specific behaviors, but for a general sense of neglect. He offered to do better, to pay more attention, to make things right. Months earlier, those words would have softened me. I would have stepped in, helped him articulate, helped him change. But now they landed differently. They came too late, not in time, but in alignment. Because the issue was never a lack of intention. It was a lack of awareness sustained by my silence. An awareness that arrives only when comfort is removed doesn't rebuild trust the same way. I could see the panic beginning, not loud, not dramatic, but internal. The scrambling to restore something he hadn't realized he depended on. He started asking what I needed. That question, once asked, should have felt validating. Instead, it felt revealing. Because if you have to ask that question only after the system starts failing, it means the system wasn't designed to notice. I answered him truthfully. I need to not be the only one holding things together. He nodded. He agreed. He meant it, but meaning it wasn't enough anymore. Because I no longer wanted to teach someone how to see me. I wanted to be seen without explanation. That was the moment I knew. Not in anger, not in sadness, in clarity. The relationship could adapt, but only if I returned to the role of guide, translator, emotional manager. And I was done with that role. He felt it. That's when the regret appeared, not about actions, but about assumptions. About having relied on me without noticing the cost. He said quietly, "I didn't know." And I believed him. But not knowing is not the same as not benefiting, and benefit without awareness still has an impact. I didn't argue, I didn't list grievances, I didn't raise my voice, I simply didn't step back into the role he was now trying to preserve. Because by the time someone notices the foundation, the structure has already shifted. And once you stop maintaining everything, you can't pretend you don't know how much it costs you to do so. It was too late, not because change was impossible, but because the price of making it work had become unacceptable. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't feel like a confrontation at all. There was no raised voice, no list of accusations, no emotional surge demanding release. By the time we sat down to talk, everything I needed to understand had already settled inside me. We were sitting across from each other in the quiet of the evening, no distractions, no urgency. He spoke first. "I don't know how we got here," he said, "but I know something broke." I let the words sit for a moment before responding. "Nothing broke," I said. "Something stopped being held." He looked at me, confused, not defensive. I explained slowly, carefully, not as an indictment, but as a description. I was maintaining more than my share, emotionally, practically, quietly. When I stopped, the imbalance became visible. I didn't use words like hurt or neglect. I didn't dramatize. I didn't need to. The truth was strong enough without heat. He listened, really listened. "I never asked you to do all that," he said. "I know," I replied. "That's part of the problem." That was the clearest moment of the entire conversation. Because intent had never been the issue. Structure had. He asked what I wanted now. And this was the only part that felt heavy, not because it was painful, but because it was final. "I want a relationship where I don't have to disappear to keep the peace," I said. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was honest. He understood then. Not everything, but enough. He saw that the version of me he wanted back was the one who carried more than her share without complaint. And that version no longer existed. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He asked quietly, "Is there anything I can do?" I thought about it. Not for his sake, but for mine. And the answer came easily. "No," I said. "Not without me going back to being someone I'm not." That was the moment the conversation ended, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the truth had already been spoken. We didn't fight, we acknowledged reality, and that strangely was peaceful. There was no sense of victory, no sense of loss either, just alignment. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't managing someone else's emotions in the room. I wasn't softening the truth. I wasn't cushioning the impact. I was simply present as myself. And that was enough to end what could no longer continue. After it ended, there was no dramatic emptiness, no free fall, no sense of collapse. What I felt instead was space, not the kind that echoes, but the kind that breathes. For a long time, my identity had been shaped by how well I could hold things together, how smoothly I could move through discomfort without naming it, how little I needed in order to feel secure. Letting go of that identity didn't feel like losing myself. It felt like meeting myself without distortion. I didn't suddenly become louder or more demanding. I didn't swing to the opposite extreme. I'm still calm, still measured, still someone who values peace. But now that peace includes me. I no longer confuse silence with strength. I no longer equate flexibility with love. I no longer believe that being easy to be with means being easy to overlook. I've learned that low maintenance is not a virtue when it becomes a disguise for self-erasure. What changed most wasn't how I behave. It was what I allow. I allow pauses without filling them. I allow discomfort without neutralizing it. I allow my needs to exist without justifying them. That has changed every relationship in my life, not through confrontation, but through clarity. People sense it, not in an intimidating way, but in a grounding one. Because when you stop compensating for imbalance, others have to meet you where you stand, or reveal that they can't. And either outcome is information. I don't carry resentment toward him. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't malicious. He simply benefited from a system I helped maintain without questioning. Understanding that freed me from bitterness. This wasn't a story about blame. It was a story about consent, about recognizing when your calm has become a service rather than a shared state, about noticing when your adaptability is being relied on instead of reciprocated. I didn't leave with anger. I left with accuracy. And accuracy is quieter than anger, but far more permanent. Now, when someone describes me as low maintenance, I listen carefully, not to the words, but to what they expect that phrase to mean. Because I know now, anything worth having requires maintenance, including me, and I'm no longer willing to be the only one doing it. There's a quiet lesson in all of this, one that doesn't fit neatly into advice or slogans. Being low maintenance is often praised as maturity, as emotional intelligence, as a strength, and sometimes it is. But sometimes it's simply the absence of visible need, and absence can be misread as abundance. When you consistently absorb discomfort, people don't see resilience. They see capacity. When you don't ask, they don't learn to offer. When you maintain everything without acknowledgement, the maintenance becomes assumed rather than appreciated. This story wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about winning. It was about what happens when you stop participating in your own invisibility. Indifference didn't punish him. It exposed dependence. Not because I withdrew love, but because I withdrew the silent labor that had been sustaining the imbalance. That's the part people rarely talk about. You don't always have to demand better treatment. Sometimes you just have to stop compensating for the lack of it. And when you do, the truth surfaces on its own. Some relationships adjust. Others reveal their limits. Neither outcome is failure. The real cost isn't losing someone who depended on your silence. The real cost is continuing to disappear in order to be kept. I didn't become colder. I became clearer. I didn't stop caring. I stopped carrying what wasn't mine. And in that clarity, I found something steadier than validation, self-trust. If this story resonates, it may not be because you've lived the same events, but because you recognize the pattern, the quiet role, the praise that feels flattering until it becomes confining, the moment when being easy to be with starts feeling like being easy to overlook. So here's the question I'll leave you with, not as a challenge, but as an invitation. Have you ever been called low maintenance and realized later how much you were actually maintaining alone? If you're comfortable, share your thoughts in the comments.